Henry Kaiser stood at the edge of the launching ways, watching welders work under portable arc lights as the evening shift began. Around him, organized chaos hummed with purpose. Cranes swinging prefabricated hull sections into position, riveters' pneumatic hammers chattering in rhythmic bursts, and the acrid smell of welding smoke mixing with the salt air from San Francisco Bay. What the assembled crowd of workers, military observers, and skeptical maritime union officials didn't know yet was that they were about to witness something that traditional shipbuilders had declared physically impossible. In exactly 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, the SS Robert E. Peary, a 10,500-ton cargo vessel measuring 441 feet long, would slide down these ways into the water. A complete ship built from keel to mast in less than a week. Traditional shipbuilding wisdom held that constructing a merchant vessel required 230 days. Kaiser's average was already down to 42 days, an achievement that had maritime experts shaking their heads in disbelief. But 4 days? That wasn't shipbuilding. That was industrial magic performed by a man who had never built a ship before in his life. The Germans were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than traditional shipyards could replace them. In 1942, German U-boats were destroying an average of 96 ships per month, roughly 3 ships every day. Each torpedoed freighter took with it not just cargo and crew, but Britain's ability to continue fighting. The mathematics were brutally simple. If ships sank faster than they could be built, Britain would starve and the war would be lost. Kaiser's solution was to throw out everything traditional shipbuilders knew about their craft and replace it with methods borrowed from dam construction, automotive assembly, and his own relentless belief that impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet. His revolutionary techniques would transform American industrial capacity, save countless lives by keeping supply lines open, and prove that sometimes the best person to solve an impossible problem is someone who doesn't know it can't be solved. The problem: ships were sinking faster than America could build them. The crisis that would make Henry Kaiser famous began not in American shipyards, but in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, where German U-boats prowled in coordinated wolf packs, hunting Allied merchant convoys with devastating effectiveness. On September 3, 1939, hours after Britain declared war on Germany, the German submarine U-30 torpedoed the British passenger liner SS Athenia, 250 miles northwest of Ireland. 117 people died, including 28 Americans. It was the opening shot of the Battle of the Atlantic, a campaign that would become the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, and the one that came closest to forcing Britain out of the war. By 1940, German U-boat tactics had evolved into the Wolfpack strategy, Rudeltaktik in German, where groups of submarines would coordinate attacks on convoys, overwhelming escorts and sinking multiple ships in rapid succession. The statistics were horrifying. In 1940, U-boats sank 471 Allied ships, totaling 2.5 million gross tons. In 1941, the numbers climbed to 432 ships and 2.1 million tons. But 1942 would be the worst year of the war for Allied shipping. After the United States entered the war in December 1941, German U-boats began operating off the American East Coast in what Admiral Karl Dönitz called Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag. American cities refused to implement blackouts, silhouetting merchant ships against the lit shoreline and making them easy targets. U-boats sank ships within sight of American beaches. In the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank 397 ships in American waters alone. The global numbers were catastrophic. In 1942, U-boats sank 1,160 Allied merchant ships, totaling 6.2 million gross tons, an average of 96 ships per month, or more than 3 ships every single day. Each ship took with it not just steel and cargo, but the food, fuel, weapons, and supplies that Britain desperately needed to continue fighting. Britain was an island nation dependent on imports for survival. Before the war, Britain imported 55 million tons of supplies annually, including 70% of its food and virtually all of its petroleum. By 1941, imports had fallen to 30 million tons. By 1942, Britain's food reserves had dropped to dangerous levels. Rationing became severe. If the trend continued, Britain would be forced to surrender, not through military defeat, but through starvation and fuel exhaustion. The strategic mathematics were straightforward and terrifying. If German submarines could sink ships faster than Allied shipyards could build replacements, the Axis would win the war without ever invading Britain. Every cargo ship represented not just tonnage, but time, the months or years required to construct, launch, and put into service a vessel capable of crossing the Atlantic under wartime conditions. Traditional American shipbuilding in 1940 was a craft industry, dominated by established yards on the East Coast that had been building ships the same way for decades. Construction methods emphasized quality, durability, and adherence to maritime tradition. A typical merchant vessel required 230 working days from keel laying to launch, roughly 8 months of continuous work. The process was methodical and sequential. The keel was laid first, forming the backbone of the ship. Frames were then erected, creating the skeleton of the hull. Workers installed longitudinal stringers connecting the frames. Only then could hull plates be attached, traditionally using rivets that required teams of specialized workers. Each rivet hole had to be drilled precisely, each rivet heated to red-hot temperature, inserted through the hole, and hammered into place by a riveting team consisting of a heater, a catcher, a bucker, and a riveter. This traditional method produced excellent ships, but it was impossibly slow given the wartime emergency. In 1940, American shipyards completed only 102 merchant vessels. At that production rate, replacing losses was impossible. The United States Maritime Commission, responsible for merchant ship construction, recognized that traditional methods would lose the war before it truly began. The Maritime Commission's solution was to design a standardized emergency cargo vessel that could be mass-produced by multiple shipyards using identical plans and interchangeable parts. The design they selected was based on a British tramp steamer design from the 1930s, a simple, economical cargo vessel that prioritized cargo capacity and ease of construction over speed and luxury. The resulting design became the EC2SC1 type, emergency cargo second design, steam-powered C1 engine type, but everyone would know these vessels by their more poetic name, Liberty ships. The Liberty ship design was deliberately simple. The vessel measured 441 feet, 6 inches long, with a beam of 57 feet and a draft of 27 feet, 9 inches. Fully loaded, it displaced 14,245 tons and could carry 10,800 deadweight tons of cargo, equivalent to 300 railroad cars or 2,840 jeeps or 440 light tanks. 5 cargo holds could accommodate a wide variety of war materials. The vessel was powered by a 2,500 horsepower triple expansion reciprocal steam engine, old-fashioned technology even by 1940 standards, but simple, reliable, and easy to manufacture. The Liberty ship was designed for a service life of just 5 years. It was intended to survive 1 or 2 Atlantic crossings, deliver its cargo, and if it was sunk by U-boats, it would have already served its purpose. These were expendable vessels built quickly and cheaply to solve an immediate crisis. But even with a simplified design, traditional construction methods were too slow. The first 2 Liberty ships, the SS Patrick Henry and SS John Fitch, were laid down in April 1941 at the Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard in Baltimore. The Patrick Henry took 244 days to complete, actually slower than the estimated 230 days due to teething problems with the new design. At this rate, American shipyards would complete perhaps 300 to 400 Liberty ships per year, but losses in 1942 would exceed 1,100 ships. The mathematics were impossible. America needed someone who could completely reimagine how ships were built. They needed someone who didn't know that what they were attempting couldn't be done. They needed Henry Kaiser, the outsider, a dam builder who knew nothing about ships. Henry John Kaiser was born on May 9, 1882 in Sprout Brook, New York, the son of German immigrants. His father was a shoemaker. The family was poor. Kaiser left school at age 13 to work as a cash boy in a dry goods store, earning $1.50 per week. By age 20, Kaiser had worked his way up to a photography business in Lake Placid, New York. He traveled door to door taking family portraits, developing the hustling sales skills and relentless optimism that would define his business career. In 1906, he moved west to Spokane, Washington, where he started a construction supply and contracting business. His break came in 1914 when he won a contract to build roads in British Columbia, his first major construction project. Kaiser's approach to construction was revolutionary for its time. He emphasized speed, efficiency, and completing projects ahead of schedule. He invested heavily in equipment, buying steam shovels, trucks, and machinery when other contractors relied on manual labor. He understood that time was money and that a contractor who finished early could move on to the next profitable job while competitors were still working on the previous one. Through the 1920s and 1930s, Kaiser built a reputation as the contractor who could do the impossible on schedule. He won contracts for major highway projects throughout the West. He formed partnerships with other contractors, creating massive joint ventures capable of tackling the largest construction projects in American history. His crowning achievement before the war was the Boulder Dam, later renamed Hoover Dam, completed in 1936. Kaiser was part of the 6 companies consortium that won the contract for what was then the largest construction project ever attempted. The dam required pouring 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete in the middle of the Nevada desert. Traditional methods would have required decades. The consortium completed it in 5 years, 2 years ahead of schedule. Kaiser's methods at Boulder Dam would directly influence his shipbuilding approach. He pioneered the use of prefabrication, building components off-site and transporting them to the construction location. He revolutionized concrete pouring by using a system of refrigerated pipes to cool the concrete as it cured, allowing continuous pouring rather than waiting months for each section to cure naturally. He ran construction operations 24 hours a day in multiple shifts, maximizing productivity. Most importantly, Kaiser understood something that traditional craftsmen often missed: the critical path. Every complex project has a sequence of tasks that determines the minimum time needed for completion. Some tasks can happen simultaneously, others must wait for prerequisites. The key to speed is identifying which tasks are on the critical path and focusing resources there relentlessly, while parallelizing everything else. By 1940, Henry Kaiser was 58 years old, a wealthy and successful construction magnate with no shipbuilding experience whatsoever. When the Maritime Commission began seeking contractors to build emergency shipyards for Liberty ship construction, Kaiser saw an opportunity. He partnered with Todd Shipyards, an established East Coast shipbuilder, and submitted a bid to build a shipyard in Richmond, California, on San Francisco Bay. The Maritime Commission was skeptical. Kaiser had built dams, roads, and bridges, impressive achievements but utterly unrelated to shipbuilding. Maritime tradition held that shipbuilding was a specialized craft requiring decades of experience, maritime knowledge, and understanding of how vessels behaved in water. The idea that a dam builder could simply start building ships seemed absurd, but the Maritime Commission was desperate. Traditional shipyards couldn't expand fast enough. The Commission needed contractors willing to build entirely new shipyards from scratch, train new workers, and produce ships in unprecedented numbers. Kaiser's track record of completing impossible projects ahead of schedule made him an acceptable risk. In January 1941, Kaiser received authorization to build his first shipyard in Richmond, California. He broke ground immediately. Within 6 months, Richmond Shipyard No. 1 was operational with 7 building ways capable of constructing 7 ships simultaneously. By the end of 1941, Kaiser had opened a second Richmond yard. Eventually, he would operate shipyards in Richmond, Portland, and Vancouver, making him the largest shipbuilder in American history. Kaiser's first Liberty ship, the S. Ocean Vanguard, was laid down at Richmond Yard No. 1 on April 14, 1941. It launched on October 15, 1941, 184 days later, significantly faster than the 244 days required for the Patrick Henry, but still far too slow to meet production needs. Kaiser knew he needed to revolutionize the process, and he had ideas that would make traditional shipbuilders furious but would transform American industrial capacity. The Revolution, welding, prefabrication, and assembly line ships. The first major innovation Kaiser implemented was one that traditional shipbuilders considered heresy. He replaced riveting with welding as the primary method of hull construction. Traditional ship construction used rivets, metal fasteners that were heated until red hot, inserted through aligned holes in overlapping metal plates, and hammered into place from both sides. Riveting required teams of 4 specialized workers: a heater who heated the rivets in a forge, a catcher who caught the red-hot rivet thrown by the heater and inserted it through the hole, a bucker who held a heavy backing end valve against one side of the rivet, and a riveter who hammered the protruding end of the rivet with a pneumatic hammer to form the second head. This process was slow, labor-intensive, noisy, and required skilled workers who had trained for years. A single Liberty ship hull required approximately 300,000 rivets. Each rivet took several minutes to install. The mathematics were brutal. Even with multiple riveting teams working simultaneously, riveting the hull plates alone consumed months of construction time. Welding offered an alternative. Electric arc welding used an electric current to create an arc between an electrode and the metal being joined, melting both the electrode and the base metal to form a fused joint. Welding was faster than riveting, required fewer workers, and produced lighter structures because overlapping plates weren't necessary. But welding was controversial in shipbuilding. Traditional maritime engineers argued that welded joints were inferior to riveted joints for ships. Rivets allowed some flexibility in the hull structure, which was important given the stresses ships endured in heavy seas. Welded joints were rigid, potentially making the hull brittle and prone to cracking. Several welded ships had experienced catastrophic failures where cracks propagated through entire hull sections, leading to structural collapse. Kaiser's response was characteristic. He didn't argue with the critics. He simply proceeded with welding and improved the techniques until they worked. He hired metallurgists to study welding procedures and identify the causes of cracking. He implemented quality control procedures to ensure welds met specifications. He trained workers extensively in proper welding techniques. Most importantly, Kaiser recognized that the alternative to imperfect welding was insufficient ships, which meant Britain starving and Germany winning the war. Perfect riveted ships that took 8 months to build were strategically useless when 3 ships per day were being sunk. Good enough welded ships that could be built in 6 weeks would win the war, even if some of them cracked. The second major innovation was prefabrication. Kaiser took techniques he had pioneered at Boulder Dam and applied them to shipbuilding. Traditional ship construction was sequential and site-specific. Workers built the ship on the building ways from the keel upward, installing each component in sequence as the structure took shape. This meant that at any given time, only certain workers could access their work areas, creating bottlenecks and idle time. Kaiser's solution was to build the ship in large prefabricated sections assembled off the building ways, then lift these complete sections with cranes and weld them together. This approach, borrowed from automotive assembly lines and dam construction, allowed parallel work streams and dramatically reduced the time ships spent on the building ways. Richmond Shipyard included massive prefabrication facilities where complete double-bottom sections, deck houses, stern sections, and bow assemblies were constructed. A double-bottom section, the lowest part of the ship's hull, including the keel, frames, and inner bottom, might measure 70 feet long and weigh 100 tons. This entire section would be fabricated in a prefabrication building, complete with internal framing, piping, and equipment already installed. When the section was complete, a massive gantry crane would lift it, transport it to the building ways, and lower it into position. Welders would then join it to adjacent sections. What had previously required weeks of on-site construction now took days or even hours once the prefabricated sections arrived at the building ways. Kaiser's prefabrication extended to every major component of the ship. Engine rooms were assembled complete with engines, boilers, condensers, pumps, and piping before being lifted into the hull as a single unit. Deck houses, the superstructure containing crew quarters, galley, and bridge, were built complete with interior finishing, installed equipment, and even furniture before being craned onto the deck. This approach required complete rethinking of construction sequencing and logistics. Traditional shipbuilders had refined their sequential processes over generations. Kaiser had to design entirely new workflows, coordinate multiple parallel work streams, and synchronize the delivery of prefabricated sections to the building ways precisely when needed. The third innovation was radical standardization and interchangeability of parts. Kaiser worked closely with the Maritime Commission to refine the Liberty ship design, focusing obsessively on manufacturability. Every component was standardized. Piping systems used standard fittings. Valves, pumps, and electrical equipment came from a limited catalog of approved suppliers. Hull sections were dimensioned to precise tolerances so they would fit together regardless of which prefabrication facility produced them. This standardization extended across all Kaiser shipyards. A deck section fabricated in Richmond was identical to one fabricated in Portland. This meant that workers could be trained using standardized procedures. Replacement parts could be manufactured by any facility, and construction documentation could be reused across all yards. Kaiser's fourth innovation was training programs to rapidly create a shipbuilding workforce from people who had never worked in heavy industry. By 1942, experienced shipbuilders were in critically short supply. The existing workforce couldn't possibly expand fast enough to meet production demands. Kaiser's solution was to design jobs that minimized the skill required while maximizing output. Instead of requiring welders to master every aspect of the trade, he broke welding into specific tasks: flat welding, vertical welding, overhead welding, and specialized joint types. Workers were trained intensively on one specific skill, then deployed to positions where that skill was needed. A worker might spend 2 weeks learning to weld flat butt joints, then be assigned to a crew that did nothing but weld flat butt joints on deck sections. This narrow specialization allowed rapid training and high quality in the specific task being performed. It was industrial assembly line logic applied to shipbuilding, and it worked. Kaiser actively recruited women, minorities, and workers who had been excluded from traditional shipbuilding. By 1943, women comprised approximately 27% of Kaiser shipyard workers, unprecedented in an industry that had been exclusively male. Rosie the Riveter became an iconic image of American wartime production, though at Kaiser's yards she was more likely Rosie the Welder. The training programs were intensive. Workers attended classes on shipbuilding basics, safety procedures, blueprint reading, and tool operation. They practiced their specific skills under supervision until they met quality standards. The entire training program took 2 to 4 weeks, after which workers were deployed to production positions. This created a workforce that traditional shipbuilders viewed with horror. Thousands of inexperienced workers performing complex industrial tasks after minimal training. Yet Kaiser's approach worked precisely because he had simplified tasks, standardized procedures, and implemented quality control checkpoints that caught errors before they became critical problems. The fifth innovation was around-the-clock operation with multiple shifts. Traditional shipyards operated primarily during daylight hours with a single shift. Kaiser ran 3 8-hour shifts covering 24 hours 7 days a week. The shipyards never stopped. When one shift left, another immediately took over. This continuous operation maximized utilization of expensive equipment and facilities. The massive gantry cranes that lifted prefabricated sections worked constantly. Building ways never sat idle. Welding equipment, cutting torches, and fabrication machinery operated continuously. The shift system also created competitive pride among workers. Each shift tracked its production metrics and took pride in outperforming other shifts. Shift competitions became legendary at Kaiser yards, with workers striving to set records for sections completed, welds finished, or equipment installed. Kaiser himself became a master of industrial motivation. He understood that worker morale directly affected production. He paid premium wages, often 20 to 30% higher than comparable industrial jobs. He provided unprecedented benefits, including health care, child care for working mothers, and housing assistance for workers who relocated to Richmond or Portland. He also understood the power of recognition and competition. When a ship launched, Kaiser hosted celebrations with speeches, music, and recognition for the workers who built it. He publicized production records, creating friendly competition between yards and shifts. He made workers feel that their labor was directly contributing to winning the war and saving lives, which it absolutely was. The proof: building the Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. By September 1942, Kaiser's methods had reduced average Liberty ship construction time from 230 days to approximately 42 days, an astonishing achievement that had already made Richmond Shipyard the most productive in the world. But Kaiser was convinced they could do better, and he decided to prove it with a publicity stunt that would demonstrate the full potential of his methods. The SS Robert E. Peary would be built in the fastest time possible, without regard for the normal production schedules or cost considerations. Every resource would be focused on this single ship. It would be a demonstration of maximum theoretical construction speed. The attempt began on September 27, 1942 at 12:01 a.m., when the first keel sections were lowered onto building way number 1 at Richmond Yard number 2. Multiple prefabricated sections had been prepared in advance, stockpiled near the building way. Specialized crews had been assembled and briefed. The entire yard was mobilized for the attempt. The construction proceeded with machine-like efficiency. Prefabricated double-bottom sections were lifted by crane and welded into place. Hull side sections followed, forming the ship's framework with remarkable speed. Welding crews worked continuously, their arc lights creating an endless constellation of sparks along the growing hull. By the end of the first day, the entire keel structure and lower hull were complete. Traditional shipbuilding would have required weeks to reach this point. The second day saw the installation of the engine room section, a prefabricated unit weighing over 500 tons that was lifted as a complete assembly and lowered into the hull. By day 3, the main deck was being installed and the superstructure was being positioned. The work continued around the clock without pause. Fresh crews rotated in every 8 hours, maintaining relentless forward momentum. Materials and prefabricated sections were delivered precisely when needed. The logistics coordinated with assembly line precision. On October 3, 1942, just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after the keel was laid, the SS Robert E. Peary, a complete 10,500-ton Liberty ship, slid down the ways into San Francisco Bay. The assembled crowd of workers, military observers, journalists, and skeptical maritime officials watched in stunned silence as the impossible became real. The ship required fitting out work before it could enter service, installing final equipment, testing systems, loading supplies, but the hull was complete and watertight. Kaiser had proven his point conclusively. A ship could be built in less than a week. The methods worked. The revolution was real. The SS Robert E. Peary entered service later that month and made 4 successful transatlantic voyages before being torpedoed by U-515 on September the 23rd, 1943, off the coast of Africa. It sank with all hands, a tragedy that underscored why these ships were needed so desperately. But in its brief service life, the Robert E. Peary had already carried thousands of tons of war materials that helped keep Britain fighting, and the ship's construction had demonstrated capabilities that would transform the entire shipbuilding program. The 4-day, 15-hour record was never meant to be standard practice. It represented maximum theoretical speed under ideal conditions with unlimited resources focused on a single vessel. But it proved that with proper methods, prefabrication, welding, and organization, ships could be built at speeds that traditional maritime experts had considered physically impossible. Kaiser's average construction time continued to improve throughout 1943 and 1944. By 1943, Richmond Shipyard's average time from keel laying to launch had dropped to just 27 days. Some ships were completed in less than 3 weeks. The entire American Liberty ship program would eventually average 42 days per ship, a 5.5 times improvement over traditional construction methods. The impact: an avalanche of ships that changed the war. The numbers tell the story with stark clarity. In 1941, American shipyards completed 102 merchant ships of all types. In 1942, they completed 597 ships, including 597 Liberty ships. In 1943, production reached 1,949 ships, including 1,896 Liberty ships. In 1944, production peaked at 2,247 ships, including 2,151 Liberty ships. Kaiser's shipyards alone produced 1,490 vessels during the war, including 821 Liberty ships, 219 Victory ships, an improved, faster design, and 50 small aircraft carriers. At peak production in 1943, Kaiser's yards launched a new ship every day, 365 ships per year from his facilities alone. The strategic impact was profound and immediate. The Battle of the Atlantic reached its crisis point in the first half of 1943, when German U-boats sank 108 ships in March alone, but American shipyards completed 140 ships that month. For the first time in the war, ship construction outpaced ship losses. The crisis point had passed. By the second half of 1943, improved anti-submarine warfare tactics, long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers, and code-breaking intelligence combined to turn the tide decisively against German U-boats. U-boat losses mounted catastrophically while sinkings of merchant ships declined. But the underlying reason Allied convoys could maintain the supply line was the vast fleet of Liberty ships carrying war materials across the Atlantic. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards completed 2,710 Liberty ships, an average of 1.9 ships launched every single day for 4 years. These vessels carried 75% of all cargo shipped overseas by the United States during the war. They transported the tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, fuel, and supplies that equipped Allied armies. They carried the food that kept Britain fed. They made the D-Day invasion possible by transporting the massive quantities of supplies needed to sustain operations in Europe. Of the 2,710 Liberty ships completed, 200 were sunk by enemy action, a loss rate of 7.4%. This was tragic but sustainable. The 200 lost ships were replaced by 200 more within 100 days. Germany simply could not sink ships faster than Kaiser and other shipyards could build them. The Liberty ship's design, while deliberately simple, proved remarkably effective. The vessels were slow. Cruising speed was just 11 knots, but reliable and capacious. They could carry 10,800 tons of cargo across any ocean. They required minimal maintenance. If damaged, they could often be repaired quickly because of their standardized design and welded construction. Some Liberty ships experienced structural failures. The welded hulls proved vulnerable to brittle fracture in cold North Atlantic waters, particularly when stress concentrations occurred at sharp corners or poorly executed welds. Several ships broke in half catastrophically, leading to intensive investigation of the causes and implementation of improved designs and welding procedures. But these failures, while tragic, did not undermine the program's success. The Liberty ship was designed as an expedient wartime vessel with a 5-year service life. That many survived decades longer is testament to their fundamental soundness. The SS John W. Brown and SS Jeremiah O'Brien survive today as museum ships, still capable of steaming under their own power 80 years after construction. Kaiser's revolution extended beyond Liberty ships. His methods influenced all subsequent American ship construction. The Victory ship, a faster 15-knot design introduced in 1944, incorporated Kaiser's prefabrication and welding techniques from the beginning. The massive program of escort carrier construction, 50 small aircraft carriers built in Kaiser's Vancouver, Washington shipyard, used the same methods to deliver complex military vessels in 3 to 4 months rather than the 18 to 24 months required by traditional naval shipyards. After the war, Kaiser's influence transformed commercial shipbuilding worldwide. Welding became standard. Prefabrication became normal practice. The idea that ships could be built using assembly line methods was no longer controversial but expected. Modern shipbuilding, with its massive building docks, gantry cranes, and modular construction, is the direct descendant of the methods Kaiser pioneered at Richmond and Portland. The human cost and the workers who built Victory. The Liberty ship program employed over 700,000 workers at its peak in 1943, representing one of the largest industrial mobilizations in American history. These workers came from every background and region. Many had never worked in heavy industry. Some had never held industrial jobs of any kind. The Richmond shipyards transformed the San Francisco Bay Area. Richmond's population increased from 23,642 in 1940 to 93,738 in 1943, a nearly 400% increase in 3 years. Portland experienced similar growth. Entire communities were built to house shipyard workers. Kaiser constructed housing developments, child care centers, healthcare clinics, and even the Permanente Foundation Health Plan, which would later become Kaiser Permanente, one of America's largest healthcare organizations. Working conditions were difficult and dangerous. Shipyard work involved heavy lifting, working at heights, exposure to extreme heat from welding, and constant noise. Safety standards, while better than many industries of the era, were still rudimentary by modern standards. Workers were killed or injured in industrial accidents with tragic regularity. The statistics are sobering. During the peak years of 1943 to 1944, American shipyards reported approximately 2,500 fatal accidents and 350,000 serious injuries. The scale of operations was so massive that even good safety practices could not eliminate all risks. Workers accepted these dangers as part of the war effort, understanding that their work was saving lives even as some lost their own. Women made up approximately 27% of Kaiser shipyard workers by 1943, an unprecedented proportion in heavy industry. These women performed every job in the yards: welding, riveting, crane operation, electrical work, pipe fitting, and even supervision. The iconic Rosie the Riveter image, while technically referring to riveting, which Kaiser had largely eliminated in favor of welding, captured the reality of women's contributions to wartime production. African American workers found unprecedented opportunities in Kaiser's shipyards, though they still faced discrimination and segregation in many aspects of employment and housing. Kaiser was more progressive than many employers of the era, but the shipyards still reflected the broader racial attitudes of the 1940s America. Nevertheless, thousands of black workers found employment, training, and wages that would have been unavailable in many other industries or regions. The sense of purpose and mission was profound. Workers understood that every ship they built would carry supplies that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. When ships they had built were sunk by U-boats, workers mourned them and redoubled their efforts. When news arrived that a Liberty ship had successfully delivered cargo to Britain or Russia, workers celebrated. Kaiser cultivated this sense of mission deliberately. He gave speeches emphasizing that shipyard workers were serving their country as surely as soldiers in combat. He publicized stories of Liberty ships surviving attacks, delivering critical cargo, or rescuing survivors from torpedoed vessels. He made certain workers knew their labor mattered. The competition between shifts and between different shipyards became legendary. When Richmond Yard No. 2 set the record with the Robert E. Peary, workers at Portland's Swan Island Yard immediately began planning to beat it. Competition drove productivity, but also created camaraderie and pride. Workers wore their yard identification badges with honor. Shift competitions created intense loyalties and good-natured rivalries. The post-war fates of these workers varied widely. Many returned to traditional peacetime employment, though the skills and experiences they gained in the shipyards often led to better opportunities than they had known before the war. Women workers largely lost their shipyard jobs as men returned from military service, facing pressure to return to traditional domestic roles, though many resisted and retained industrial employment. The shipyards themselves were dismantled rapidly after the war. Liberty ship production ended in 1945 when the last vessel was completed. Kaiser's Richmond yards were closed and eventually demolished. The vast industrial infrastructure that had transformed the Bay Area economy simply disappeared. Portland's shipyards met similar fates. By the 1950s, little physical evidence remained of the massive industrial mobilization that had employed hundreds of thousands and built thousands of ships, but the legacy endured in the people who had been part of it. Veterans of Kaiser's shipyards spoke for the rest of their lives about the experience, the grueling work, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the pride in contributing to victory. They had been part of something extraordinary, an industrial achievement that had helped win the war and demonstrated what American industry could accomplish when fully mobilized. The aftermath, Kaiser's legacy, and post-war influence. Henry Kaiser emerged from World War II as an industrial celebrity, famous for accomplishing what experts had declared impossible. His wartime achievements led to major post-war ventures in multiple industries, not all of which succeeded. Kaiser's most successful post-war venture was Kaiser Permanente, the healthcare organization that grew from the wartime health plans he established for shipyard workers. By providing comprehensive health care to workers and their families, Kaiser had pioneered what would become the Health Maintenance Organization HMO model. Kaiser Permanente grew into one of America's largest nonprofit healthcare organizations, serving over 12 million members by the 21st century. Kaiser also entered automobile manufacturing, establishing Kaiser Frazer Corporation in 1945. His goal was to build affordable, innovative automobiles for the mass market. The company produced several interesting designs and sold reasonably well immediately after the war, when automobile production was ramping up and demand exceeded supply. But Kaiser lacked the expertise, distribution network, and economies of scale possessed by established manufacturers. By 1955, Kaiser Frazer had ceased automobile production in the United States, though operations continued in Argentina until 1962. Kaiser's construction and engineering businesses continued successfully for decades. Involved in major projects worldwide, Kaiser Engineers and Kaiser Industries remained significant corporations through the 1970s and 1980s, gradually being absorbed or merged with other companies. But Kaiser's greatest legacy was intangible, the proof that American industrial capacity, properly organized and led, could accomplish objectives that seemed impossible. The Liberty Ship program demonstrated that traditional assumptions about what was feasible were often merely cultural habits that could be overturned by someone willing to question fundamental premises. The concept of impossible in engineering and manufacturing had always carried two meanings: physically impossible due to laws of nature, and conventionally impossible because established practice said it couldn't be done. Kaiser's achievement was recognizing that most impossible tasks fell into the second category and could be conquered through innovative thinking, proper organization, and relentless execution. This lesson influenced American industrial development for decades. The post-war aerospace industry, which accomplished seemingly impossible achievements like developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, putting humans on the moon, and creating commercial jet aviation, drew directly on the organizational and management techniques Kaiser pioneered. The idea that massive, complex projects could be completed through standardization, prefabrication, parallel work streams, and careful attention to the critical path became fundamental to project management across all industries. Kaiser's willingness to ignore conventional wisdom and hire unconventional workers, women, minorities, and people without traditional credentials, demonstrated that talent and ability existed in populations that traditional industries had systematically excluded. While progress toward genuine equality remained painfully slow in post-war America, the wartime experience of integrated workforces performing complex industrial tasks made it impossible to credibly argue that entire categories of people were inherently incapable of such work. The specific technical innovations Kaiser pioneered in shipbuilding, extensive use of welding, large-scale prefabrication, modular construction, and standardization, became standard practice not just in shipbuilding, but across all heavy industrial construction. Modern shipyards, whether building container ships in South Korea, naval vessels in the United States, or offshore oil platforms in Singapore, all use methods that descend directly from Kaiser's wartime innovations. The management techniques Kaiser employed, intensive training programs to rapidly upskill workers, continuous operation with multiple shifts, competition between work groups to drive productivity, comprehensive benefits to attract and retain workers, and constant attention to worker morale became standard practice in American industry. The concept that workers were assets to be invested in rather than interchangeable commodities to be exploited was not invented by Kaiser, but his wartime success demonstrated its effectiveness at industrial scale. Perhaps most significantly, Kaiser proved that crisis could be opportunity. When faced with an impossible problem, ships sinking faster than they could be built using traditional methods, he didn't accept the constraints that traditional experts assumed were immutable. He questioned every assumption, borrowed techniques from unrelated industries, trained inexperienced workers to perform complex tasks, and delivered results that changed the course of history. Henry Kaiser died on August 24, 1967, at age 85. His obituaries celebrated him as an industrial pioneer who had helped win World War II. But the full significance of his achievement extended far beyond the 2,710 Liberty ships his yards produced. He had demonstrated that American industrial capacity, when properly mobilized and intelligently directed, could accomplish objectives that seemed to violate the basic constraints of time and feasibility. The ships that survived, Liberty ships in post-war service. The Liberty ship program officially ended in September 1945 when the last vessel was completed. By that point, the urgent wartime need had passed. Victory in Europe came in May 1945. Victory over Japan followed in August. The vast fleet of Liberty ships suddenly had no immediate purpose. The initial expectation was that Liberty ships would be scrapped quickly. They had been designed as emergency vessels with 5-year service lives, built to solve an immediate crisis rather than to serve for decades. With the war over, commercial shipping companies could return to building traditional, more efficient vessels designed for peacetime cargo service. But economics intervened. The 2,510 Liberty ships still afloat in 1945 represented an enormous investment of materials and labor. Scrapping them immediately seemed wasteful. Many were nearly new, having been completed in late 1944 or 1945 and seeing minimal service before the war ended. The vessels might be simple and slow, but they were functional and capacious. The United States Maritime Commission initially placed hundreds of Liberty ships in reserve fleets, mothball fleets, anchored in various bays and rivers around the United States. The ships were preserved with dehumidification equipment and minimal maintenance, ready to be reactivated if needed. Other Liberty ships were sold to commercial shipping companies at bargain prices, often 10 to 20% of their original construction cost. Many Liberty ships found continued employment in commercial service, carrying cargo on routes where speed was less important than capacity and economy. The 11-knot cruising speed that had been adequate for wartime convoys worked equally well for bulk cargo transport in peacetime. Liberty ships carried grain, coal, ore, and general cargo for decades after the war ended. The Korean War in 1950 to 1953 created renewed demand for cargo vessels, and many mothballed Liberty ships were reactivated. The vessels proved their worth once again, demonstrating that Kaiser's emergency ships were robust enough for extended service when properly maintained. Some Liberty ships were converted to specialized purposes. Several became floating grain storage facilities. Others were converted to carry lumber, vehicles, or bulk liquids. A few became training ships for maritime academies. The Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis began his post-war shipping empire by purchasing surplus Liberty ships cheaply and operating them profitably in international trade. The last Liberty ships in commercial service operated into the 1970s, 30 years after their construction, 6 times their design service life. This extended service life validated the fundamental soundness of the design. While Liberty ships were never optimal cargo vessels by peacetime standards, they were practical, economical, and surprisingly durable. Today, only 2 Liberty ships remain operational, the SS John W. Brown, maintained by Project Liberty Ship in Baltimore, and the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, preserved in San Francisco. Both vessels steam regularly, taking passengers on excursions and serving as floating museums. The O'Brien participated in the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, crossing the Atlantic under its own power to Normandy, a remarkable achievement for a vessel built in 1943 during the height of the wartime emergency. These surviving ships serve as tangible evidence of Kaiser's achievement. Visitors can walk their decks, descend into engine rooms powered by 80-year-old steam engines, and see firsthand the welded hulls and utilitarian design that revolutionized shipbuilding. The vessels are modest and unassuming, exactly as Kaiser intended. They were never meant to be elegant or impressive. They were meant to carry cargo, survive the Atlantic crossing, and contribute to victory. That they continue functioning 8 decades later is testament to the fundamental soundness of Kaiser's approach.